Good evening, everybody. This is Brendan Baylod, and you are on the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. Welcome to our weekly show, Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live. It should be a great show tonight. I'm really excited about our guest tonight, a person who I've known for many years, and I'm really excited to have on the show. Many of you probably recognize her. It's Valerie Olson van Heest from Michigan Shipwreck Research Association. So I'll give everybody a couple of minutes to join and start to get online. If you are already online, drop a message in the comments so that we know you're here. Helps us to know that we're actually reaching an audience, and we don't have a technical glitch. So looking forward to hearing from everybody. So a couple of quick housekeeping things that I'd like to get out of the way. We've had a lot of new members on the group lately. And so welcome to all our new members, people who have just joined the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group. I want to extend a special thanks to the people who have been posting some really interesting original content. So thank you to everybody who's been doing that. A couple of other things. I have some really big guests coming on the show that I'm really also excited about, that I want to let you know about. Next week is going to be Tamara Thompson. Tammy is the state underwater archaeologist for the state of Wisconsin. And you may remember her from our Inland Seas Virtual Shipwreck Festival, where she did an excellent talk about all the wrecks on the National Register of Historic Places. Well, she's going to be my guest next week. So I'm really looking forward to interviewing Tammy. I've known her for years, and she's a real groundbreaking woman in Great Lakes maritime history and underwater archaeology, much like our guest tonight. And I haven't announced this to anyone yet, well, except for Valerie. But the week after Tammy, we have a legend of Great Lakes shipwreck hunting that's going to be on the show. Dave Trotter is going to be joining us. And as many of you probably know, Dave has found more shipwrecks, I think, than any person alive on the Great Lakes. And, he is a real pioneer and a great presenter and interview, too. So I'm really, really excited to talk with Dave. Dave's a good friend, and boy, what a show that's going to be. So make sure you mark your calendars and tell your friends about it. All right. So we have another thing, the piece of housekeeping before we get to our guest, and that is Facebook has started this new thing, Facebook group chats and rooms. So I'm going to try, instead of using a Zoom room tonight, I'm going to try using Facebook's new room functionality. We'll see how it goes. I've sort of kind of tried to set one up on the group. So when I get in there, I'm going to set up the room. You should just have to go to to our discussion page, the Great Lakes Shipwreck Research Group's page, and you should see it on there. A link, I think. Not sure exactly how it works, but this will be an experiment. And we'll try it again next week if it works out. So without further ado, I'm so excited to have Valerie Van Heest on the show. I've known Valerie, I think we were just talking, since 1998, 97, something like that, when I was really interested in learning about the Lady Elgin. And there was just a ton of misinformation swirling around out there about the Lady Elgin wreck site and where was it and could you dive it. And Valerie knew more about the Lady. She'd forgotten more about the Lady Elgin than anybody else knew. So she was so kind to reach out to me, a person who really, didn't know anything about anything. I was very new at this at the time, and she was very gracious with her information. And we got to know each other and got to be friends. And so I'm so excited to have Valerie. Valerie, welcome to Great Lakes Shipwrecks Live, and thank you so much for being on the show.
This is fun. It's been fun talking to you over the last couple days too. So catching up.
Definitely. Yeah, Valerie and I, with the COVID, and plus with Ghost Ships Festival kind of going away, I hadn't been around too much, and so it was really great to talk and catch up. Yeah. We talked a couple of times with the Expedition Unknown stuff that we were working together.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was great. So, just to get started then, Valerie, the same question I ask everybody. The kind of purpose of the show is really for people to get to know these folks in the Great Lakes, maritime history and shipwreck community. So, can you tell me a little bit about how you got started in this? I know you started out in Chicago working in architecture, and how did you end up becoming sort of the queen of Lake Michigan shipwrecks?
I don't know about queen, but I started diving because my dad was a Navy diver. And so when I was 16, he had a buddy. His buddy was Sam Davison, who had started Decor Corporation. My dad and Sam kind of brainstormed this idea of starting a scuba gear manufacturing company. And Sam got it up and running. And yeah, there I am at 16 years old in Racine Quarry. And when I started working for Decor as just a summer helper in the factory, Sam wanted all of his employees to learn to dive. And so I learned to dive, and it opened up a whole new world. And if I were to imagine that skill of diving would still be going strong all these years later, I think it's 3 years since I was 16. But yeah, it's just been 3 years. It's really formed a second career for me. I've made some of the best friends I've ever had through diving. I met my husband through diving. My kids are now divers. So it's been a wonderful sport and a wonderful avocation.
Very cool.
Yeah.
So how did you go from being sort of a 16-year-old diver to being involved in Chicago shipwrecks? I recall when I met you, you were one of the prime movers, if not one of the founders of a really great group that I'm a big fan of, the Underwater Archaeology Society of Chicago.
Yeah, so that picture there, that is Dave Truitt on top of his boat Intrigue. And that's what the UASC was using when they formed in about 87. It was actually part of the Chicago Maritime Museum. And they had formed a dive committee. And they had started surveying the David Dow's, the 5-masted schooner that's off Chicago, South Chicago. And I didn't know a lot of divers, so I had been diving for about 10 years at that point, but not regularly. And so when I accidentally ran into this group, they invited me out to work on the David Dow's project. And as it turned out, they were struggling with how to record things underwater. They were going down, taking a measurement, coming up, hollering out the measurement. Somebody was writing it down. And it turned out with my architectural skills, I was used to drawing on plastic film called Mylar, and I had some ability to draw. And so I sort of helped create ways to record underwater on a slate board. And that's our team getting ready to go out. Keith Pearson, you've heard of him before. He was a early person involved in this with Dave Truitt there. And so we went out and surveyed the David Dow's, and shortly thereafter, the A&T recovery folks, I know you've had Terrace Lacinco on the program, they had recently found the schooner Wells Bird, and it was loaded with artifacts. And this was just at a pivotal point in time, 88, 89, where the laws were changing, and they didn't want to see this virgin shipwreck with all kinds of artifacts pillaged. And so they asked our organization to put together a project. And we did, and raised money. We really grew the organization, got a lot of divers with skills, Bob Gadboy with his camera, Chet Childs, Joe Oliver, really quality underwater photographers, a lot of people with sketching ability. And we did a wonderful project. We did a lot of talks. We shared this new idea of preserving shipwrecks rather than taking artifacts. It was new back then. And we thought all was well. And then about a year after the Wells Bird became public knowledge, there was a big theft, a lot of dead eyes. I think, Brendan, you have a picture the next picture is some of the dead eyes on the Wellsburt, and 10 of those were taken, and it ended up Hollywood came calling. There was a show called Missing Reward, and they had heard about the theft and did a little 10-minute segment that we were involved in helping them film. And it really kind of highlighted this change of times where, divers were transitioning from taking artifacts. That was when I learned in the 70s, that's what everybody did, to trying to follow this new law. And so the Wellsburt was sort of a test case. And I would say that was kind of the last major big theft from a shipwreck. And ever since then, people are a little bit more respectful. Interestingly, towards about the 90s, when we became involved with the Lady Elgins, Harry Zeik had found that shipwreck. The state of Illinois brought the UASC in to survey it. I ended up testifying in court. That was a big court case, but that was an interesting time because in the early 90s, the zebra mussels were coming into the Great Lakes. They were cleaning up the water, and at the same time, camera gear was becoming a little bit more affordable. And so with that project, we sort of saw a change in diver attitudes. It was better to take pictures and leave the artifacts. Of course, the Lady Elgin case was a big, again, transitional case where divers, in this case, Harry Zeik, were sort of testing these new laws. So I know you know a lot about that, Brendan.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, really fascinating. That's I got to know Harry actually after I got to know you. And it was really fascinating to me to learn about how the different law was implemented in different states and how different states approached that stuff. And you got really active in that kind of work with UASC. And I know there were a lot of other wrecks that you guys worked on with UASC and responding sort of that passage of that law. What were some of the others?
Well, Chicago had always been a prime area for shipwrecks, a lot of traffic in and out of Chicago, a lot of accidents. There were, probably 20 well-known shipwrecks off Chicago, and some of them had been identified, others hadn't. And our team got involved in documenting them. We sort of used these techniques that we developed with the David Dow's project to do, I think what's been called reconnaissance level surveys, recording what's there, creating drawings. It helped that I had, architectural background. I did a lot of those drawings, and that really became sort of a neat thing to promote diving, because now as the water was clearing up, visibility was getting better, we would pass out these drawings and divers could better plan their dives and know what to look for. And so we probably surveyed about 20 shipwrecks, Lucille, Wings of the Wind, Rotarian, the Louisville, some of the known ones, but there were also probably a dozen unknown identity shipwrecks. And we weren't that interested, interestingly, back then at trying to figure out what they were. Now I would be all over that. I'm no longer in Chicago, but I know the UASC now is starting to get involved in trying to identify some of these long ago discoveries.
Yeah, definitely. Jim Jarecki and I have been really kind of making a lot of plans, to look at some of these. I've gotten a little in the Indiana wrecks because I think they're ignored and unloved. But
sure, yeah.
So
Right.
Eventually, Valerie, one of the ththings that you made a huge impact on Chicago and on Chicago shipwrecks, and that alone was, a really substantial contribution. But then you ended up moving to Michigan. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah.
How it happened, and of course the major thing you did there with starting the MSRA.
Well, yeah. So show me your face again. Well, you're not going to show me your face. You're showing pictures, but I like talking to you, Brendan. But so when I met this character that you're seeing here, Jack Van Heest, I met him at Ghost Ship. No, not at Ghost Ships. At Ford Seahorses. I was doing a presentation. It was back in the days of slide projectors, dissolved slide projectors. There was a problem with the slides, the organization of the slides, and I got through it. But afterwards, Jack came up to me. I didn't know him. We had a great conversation, and the next thing you know, we're exchanging phone numbers. He lived in Michigan. And so I came up and visited. He came down to Chicago to visit. We went diving. And about a year later, we were married. And as it turns out, we just figured out that tonight is our 25th anniversary. So after 25 years, we tend to forget those things. But yeah, and we were married underwater, as all good divers must be. And then we had a church ceremony for the landlubbers. But so I moved to Michigan from Chicago, and thought that I would keep doing with Jack over here what I had done there, and surprised me to find out that there were about 2 shipwrecks that were discovered over here already, between, Indiana and Holland, where we were living. And so diving and documenting shipwrecks wasn't going to be very easy. And having gone to the Ford Seahorses show for a number of years, I had met Dave Trotter, that you're going to be talking to in a couple of weeks. And I thought, well, what if we got him to come over to West Michigan and help us look for shipwrecks? And he had been doing his own thing for years. And it was really kind of neat that he agreed to sort of be a, not a gun for hire, but a side scan for hire. And so we partnered with him starting in 1998 was our first expedition with Dave. And we sort of had a unique approach to searching for shipwrecks. We started that year our first annual, we call it the Beneath the Inland Sea show here in Holland. And it was a fundraiser. And we took the money from that event. We had several hundred people come, and we took the proceeds from that event and we paid for Dave's services and the gas for the boat. By then, Jack and I had a boat. And so we used our boat and started hunting for shipwrecks. Now, at that point in time, we had started the Southwest Michigan Underwater Preserve. We didn't start it. We kind of came into it. You see some early members of that group now. Jack and I and our partner Craig Rich and Jeff Reynolds, we were all part of the helping form the Southwest Michigan Underwater Preserve Committee. And to get promotion for that preserve, we wanted to go out and find more shipwrecks. There were some 30 reported accidents in this general region between Indiana and Muskegon along the western shore. But of course, all the preserves are sport diving depths, so they're territory that's 130 feet or less. And we did, for the first 3 years working with Dave, we covered a lot of territory in the preserve boundaries, and we didn't find anything. And as we got more adept at research, I know we tapped into your knowledge, Brendan, over the years. You had really excelled in gathering data. And so as we started to look at some of these shipwrecks and their stories, we started to realize they're probably going to be in deeper water beyond preserve boundaries. And indeed, I think it was 2001 when we actually moved our search into deeper water outside of the preserve. And lo and behold, we discovered what was the H.C. Akeley, a steamer lost in 1883, excuse me. And that was in deep water for back then, 275 feet. Certainly nothing that Craig or Jack or I would dive to. And so at that point, we began working with Jeff Voss and Todd White and Bob Underhill. They're all longtime divers, technical divers. We brought them into the fold, and they made the first dives on the Akeley. And at that point, we realized that this was not going to be, none of these wrecks were going to be in the preserve. So it was 2001 that we formed the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association, largely to do the research and searching for wrecks that were still off West Michigan, but in deeper water. And so that became a long-standing nonprofit 501c3 organization. And we continued with the same methodology where we would have our annual fundraising event and raise money for the side scan sonar expedition each year. We typically put in 10 days each year. That's the amount of time Dave could spare, take away from his work in Lake Huron and come work with us. And I'd say we covered typically about 20 square miles in that period of time. We were lucky if we would get 6 or 7 good weather days out of a 10-day window. And we had a number of successes, round numbers. Over the last 20 years working with Dave, we found 10 shipwrecks. So we were averaging about 1 shipwreck every other year. And gosh, if we say 20 years, 20 square miles a year, we've probably covered about 400 square miles with Dave. And then I think all about where we went from there, Brendan. Got a little off course. Started becoming interested in an airplane.
Oh, yeah.
The funny thing about this is Craig Rich brought this to my attention, and he said, Valerie, we found the Akeley. We should go looking for this airplane. This was a big disaster. This was Northwest Airlines Flight 2501, and in 1950 it crashed in Lake Michigan. It was the worst aviation disaster in the country at the time. 58 people died. And Craig said, hey, we've got, 1 shipwreck under our belts. Let's go looking for this plane. And I remember laughing, saying, gosh, it took us, 3-4 years to find this big steamship. How long would it take to find, an airplane that's probably in bits and pieces scattered? And so I kind of poo-pooed the whole idea. He had done enough research to know a bit about this. He wrote an article picked up in a local newspaper here, and lo and behold, a certain author named Clive Cussler, I think all of us divers know about Clive Cussler, he contacted Craig, interested in a certain airplane. There is Mr. Cussler himself, who sadly we just lost this year, died earlier this year. But Clive had actually reached out, called Craig, and wondered if the Michigan Shipwreck Research Association wanted his help. And well, gosh, you just don't turn down Clive Cussler. So in 2004, Clive sent his side scan sonar expert, Ralph Wilbanks, from South Carolina here to the Great Lakes. And of course, they were noteworthy for finding the Hunley off Charleston, South Carolina, plus dozens of other shipwrecks around the world. And so we were honored to be working with Clive and his team. Clive came to Holland on a couple of occasions, so there's our whole team with in the middle there. And for anybody who's been kind of following the exploits of Flight 2501 and our search, let's see. We thought maybe it would take a couple years to find that. Well, it's been about 15 years, 16 years now, and we have not found it. But we have found 10 other shipwrecks with Clive and Ralph. Ralph spent the lion's share of time on the water, and we would go out there when we wanted to. So God bless Ralph for spending all that time out there. But every time they made a discovery, our team documented it. We would write about these discoveries. We would share the discoveries, and really everything that we did with all of the discoveries made with Dave and all the discoveries made with Clive. It was always our team's operating modus operandi to share these discoveries with the public, because we weren't funding this ourselves. The public or Clive was funding these searches. So between Dave's discoveries and Clive's, the discoveries made with Clive and Ralph, this is some of them. There's about 20 different discoveries. And the one you're seeing at the bottom, I guess, right, the Hennepin, that was one of the discoveries we made with Dave Trotter. And that was really a pretty pivotal discovery. That was the first self-unloader ever sailing on any of the Great Lakes. And of course, now 80% of the ships sailing are self-unloaders, all sort of modeled after the belt unloading system on the Hennepin. So, what we've been able to do with each of these discoveries is really take these to a level much beyond, we of course encourage sport divers, technical divers to visit all these, but we've made it a point to really interpret these heavily. The Hennepin, I sought out a grant and we wrote a nomination. It's now the first shipwreck in the Lake Michigan waters in Michigan that is listed on the National Register. We, I think, had that listed in 2006. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the Thomas Hume, a little bit, that's the bottom left, the teal color drawing. That's a little bit out of our territory. That was a discovery made by A&T Recovery. They turned it over to their associates, Tom Pomazano and Jeff Strunka, and they got our team involved. And we went after a grant, and we did a really very thorough archaeological examination, loaded with artifacts, and the grant allowed us to write a book, do a museum exhibit, and do a public presentation. Lee Murdoch ended up writing a song about that. So it was really very heavily interpreted. And, an interesting thing to mention, starting with the Hennepin discovery, I reached out to somebody I found online, a fellow by the name of William Lafferty from Ohio. I'd never met him before. He really didn't travel in the shipwreck circle, but he had something online about research he had done on self-unloaders. And wouldn't you know, we connect. He had done quite a bit of research on the Hennepin, and after a couple conversations, he and I had formed a business partnership with him as a curator and me as a museum exhibit designer. And our first exhibit was on the Hennepin, and our second exhibit was about the Thomas Hume, and these ran in various different museums, and both of them traveled. So this, again, like I said in the beginning, diving has taken me in a direction I never imagined going, that, I could take my architectural skills and my diving skills and now be running a museum exhibit design business.
Very cool, Valerie.
Yeah.
Bill Lafferty, wow, what a guy. The first time I ever met him online, we were collaborating on stuff, and the guy has like an eidetic memory about vessels, and he remembers every photo and every detail. I've never met anyone quite like him. He's
He
a
is
impressive guy.
he is amazing. I'm sure he's of genius level, and I'm sure you are as well. And there's, a few of you brainiacs, maritime brainiacs, but he since 2008, he is my go-to person for anything research. He's always he's got a picture or he's got information. He yeah, he's just always turning up little bits of research. And for people that are heavily involved in research, you'll see him chiming in on various Facebook sites. And he's quiet until he knows the answer, and then boom, everybody's surprised when he pulls out these facts. So love him.
Yeah. I posted I've had a Stereopticon. I had really obscure ship. I had no idea what it was. You couldn't see the name. I post on the Great Lakes Maritime Antiquities group a lot.
Yeah.
Great group, by the way. If you're interested in old Great Lakes books,
absolutely,
pictures, artifacts, not shipwreck artifacts, but
right.
I'd recommend it highly. I posted on there, and he's like, "Oh yes, that's the Lawrence." And I'm like, "What? I haven't even heard of the Lawrence." He knew it right off the top of his head. Really,
yeah, he sure did. And interestingly, after we did a couple of projects, exhibits about shipwrecks, he was doing some research up in Ludington, and he learned that back in, I think it was 2008, that they were planning to develop a museum in the old Coast Guard station at Ludington. And Bill came to me and said, I think we're going to propose doing the exhibit design for them. And it was a long process, 2008 to opening in 2017, but it is now one of the premier maritime museums in Michigan. I think it's about the third largest, 8,000 square feet. And Bill curated all of the exhibits. There's about 34 different exhibits, and I designed all of the exhibits, and our fabrication team built the exhibits, and we're very proud of that museum. So if the world ever opens up again, I would encourage people. We're in the process now, and one of the reasons we've been talking, Brendan, as you know, quite a bit about the Armistice Day storm, and we're developing a new exhibit opening sometime this year at the Port of Ludington Maritime Museum about the 4 ships, well, actually it was 6 ships that had incidents near the Ludington shore in that storm. So very exciting exhibit. I love doing any kind of museum exhibit, but if it's one about shipwrecks, I'm in seventh heaven.
We'll talk a little bit more about those. I know we've got some imagery that we'll put up when we talk about that a little bit more detail. But I wanted to ask you, one of the things that you're really active in is you're a widely published author, and my favorite book, honestly, that you did is on the Lady Elgin, and much to the dismay of my old friend Harry Zeich. But I was so impressed with that book because there's been so much folklore and oral tradition about the Lady Elgin that floated around, like the Irish Union Guard had gone to Chicago to hear Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln debate. Well, sure. You uncovered that Douglas wasn't even there, and what a great book that was, Valerie. And I'd like you to talk a little bit, if you would, about the many books that you wrote, because they're all excellent. And I'd encourage our viewers, if you can find these, they're not all easy to find, to get them.
Well, yeah, they're all. Well, my first book, Icebound, that is not in print anymore. That was my first one. It was written for young readers. And like a lot of authors, you go into this thinking that, writing a book for kids is going to be easy. It's not. It's very specific. I was thankful that I had a 12-year-old neighbor girl who's highly read, and she actually gave me some great input for writing that for young readers. But that ended up getting published, and it won an award. And so it sort of encouraged me to tackle other subjects. Bill Lafferty and I together did Buckets and Belts. That was soon after the Hennepin Discovery. Bill and I wrote the book about the Thomas Hume. And after those, I really enjoyed the process. And so as the 150th anniversary of the Lady Elgin sinking approached in 2010, 2010 was the 150th anniversary. I was asked to do a talk about it at the Dawson Museum in 2010, and about 9 months before that program, I decided to write a book, and Mac McAdam had asked me to do that. And I remember he later said, oh, he thought I was going to do a little pamphlet. And so when he got this thick hardback book in time for the anniversary, he was pretty surprised. Brendan, I know you and I talked a lot about that. You kind of set me off in certain directions, but that was really a case where nothing substantial had been written about the Lady Elgin. A lot of articles had been written, and they all they continued to report these facts that, as it turns out, were not facts at all. They were sort of lore, like the number of people that died, the number of Irish versus Germans who died, the number of orphans that were created. So I set out to use only primary information, as I know you do when you write, and not let a bit of lore into this. And I just loved debunking that. And so as I continued to write, that was sort of what I tried to do, is use only primary information, work in primary accounts from survivors and witnesses. And that's what I did with the Lost and Found book. That's a book about 20 stories of Lake Michigan shipwrecks, where the premises, we learn more from the discovery of the shipwreck than we ever would have known, if these hadn't been discovered. So, and then of course my pride and joy is Fatal Crossing, which after, it was after 10 years of working with Cussler's team, doing all the research to try to pinpoint where that airplane crashed so we could find the wreckage. I realized I had learned far more about the accident and the people and the 1950 search effort. I learned way more from doing the research than we would ever learn from finding the wreckage. So I decided to launch this book. It's been about 5 years ago now, and it's still going strong. People love a mystery, and people love reading it and speculating where it might be. And maybe one day we'll find it, and maybe somebody else will find it, or maybe it'll never be found. But
well, as we all know, Harry already found it, right?
Well, he has found everything, but yeah, always some controversy. You brought up the Lady Elgin. At one time, you helped me approach Harry and talk about co-authoring the book. But I'll tell you, in hindsight, looking back at his discovery of the Lady Elgin and what he tried to do, he raised a lot of artifacts just when the law had begun in 1989. And we look at that today and, we frown upon that. It is against the law, but he was testing a new law, and a new law that a lot of divers back then didn't like. And the state really cracked down on that hard because they were trying to, position, set precedents for the new law. But you know what? It was one of the few ships in all the Great Lakes that actually had some gold on it, not a lot. Harry found a safe, it had gold and silver coins in it. And I challenge any diver out there to consider what they would do if they found a safe with gold on the bottom. Would you leave it there and call the state? I don't think so.
Very good questions. It's true. The times are so different now, and it's so easy to look back at that transitional time between the goodie bag days and the preservation days.
Right.
A good period of about 8 years there, where boy, the world was changing. Good point, Valerie. So
I tried to, in the book, try to get people, present the information so they understood what he was facing through this discovery, and what he had hoped. He had hoped that his artifacts would become a museum exhibit. And yet there was so much controversy that now it's debatable whether a museum will ever, tackle this subject. So
very true.
Yeah.
Well, I had this slide in the deck. This is you and Jack and the girls.
It is. So, we always hoped that if we had kids, they'd be interested, and signed them up for diving lessons when they were, my youngest was 10 and my oldest was 12. And that's about when we took the lessons. So we had this posed family photograph, and they have continued to dive. We've had them on some shallow wrecks. The Nova Dock off Pentwater is just a wonderful shallow water clear dive. Highly recommend that to anybody. Looks like my TV mysteriously popped on. How does that happen?
Who knows? It is interesting, though. My kids seem to love this stuff, Valerie. My own son, who is the same age, I think, as your oldest daughter.
Yeah.
Going wreck hunting with me in 2 weeks. We're going on a major expedition together, and
how fun!
It'll be a lot of fun. Yeah, he's gotten certified to dive, and he is really looking forward to finding some shipwrecks. We'll see what we do.
Well, yeah, I don't know if I can say that my kids would do that, but they sure did like Cozumel, and we did a trip there, and we did some trips to Florida, and just the. Thank goodness we did a trip at Christmas, went and swam with the manatees in Crystal River, Florida, because I don't know when we're going to be traveling next. But they love diving and the underwater world. And so we're so glad to bring them in on that.
Very cool, Valerie. So let's talk a little bit about your work with museum curation with Lafferty van Heest. So one of the things that I know you and I share in common is I of course, am an antiquarian, and I've worked with a lot of different museums, but not in the same capacity as you. I've been on the board, like the Wisconsin Maritime Museum, and helping tell stories about shipwrecks to the public and helping people understand, the role of our great, sort of maritime heritage here in the Great Lakes, which is not real visible outside of museums. And I really applaud the work that you've done. Why don't you tell me a little bit about how you got involved in this and some of the work that you guys have been doing?
Well, yeah, as I said, Bill Lafferty learned about Ludington's plans back in 2008. He had actually grown up in the Chicago area like I had. He's a few years older than me, but he spent a lot of his childhood in Ludington, was a fan of the car ferries long before I ever even understood there were steamships on the Great Lakes. And although we interviewed against, I should say, a lot of other big firms, we got that project largely because of his extensive knowledge of Ludington's maritime history. What you're seeing here is an exhibit that's open now at not technically open, but it has been running at the Michigan Maritime Museum in South Haven. We've done a number of exhibits for them. This one is called Lake Michigan Answers the Call to Duty. It's about all the roles that the home front water-based industries played during World War II, shipping and fishing and the airplane, the pilot training on the Great Lakes. So that's been up and running for a couple of years, and we're now starting to work on a new exhibit for them. The Michigan Maritime Museum is undertaking an extensive campus remodeling, building a new building, and we're involved in brainstorming those first exhibits. And this is pretty interesting because it's not very often that an explorer who wrote a book about an airline accident also got to design an exhibit about this airline accident. This was an exhibit created for the Michigan Maritime Museum. It ran there for 4 years. It's now traveled. It's at the Yankee Air Force Museum, and it will be there all of this year. It's unfortunate that a couple of months now it's had to be closed, and then at the end of the year it's moving to the Door County Maritime Museum. So this is this story it is going to reach a lot of people, and what's so interesting and tragic is when you consider, we all know about all the shipwreck incidents in the Great Lakes, but this is one of only 3 major airline accidents, and interestingly, they all happened in the southern basin of Lake Michigan. This was the only major airliner crash where there was so great a loss of life. Of course, there have been a lot of small planes, military planes that have gone down in the Great Lakes, but this is really close to home, and while none of the victims were from local areas, they were from East Coast, West Coast, or Minneapolis area. It's really an exhibit that makes us stop and think that, anything can happen to anybody at any time. And so it really makes us appreciate life that we have and be grateful for every day. And, as we face this pandemic and we start hearing about how many people are losing their lives, it just makes life that much more precious. And that's what the exhibit conveys, and that's what the book conveys. And so I hope people will read the book or visit the exhibit.
Very neat, Valerie. So these are really beautiful displays, and I'm looking at these exhibits that you've designed. Now, do you fabricate these as well and actually do the media?
We're actually one of the few, I would say maybe one of the only exhibit design firms that does the curatorial work as well as the graphic work, as well as the fabrication. There's a lot of firms that do the graphic and fabrication, but they rely on curatorial by the museums. But what Bill and I realized is that, back in 2008 with the recession then, museums were losing some of their curatorial staff. And so in many instances, we would fulfill that role. We continue to do that at Ludington. It's not just shipwrecks or maritime. We can tackle any subject. Right now, I'm doing an exhibit on sporting, of all things. I'm not really involved in organizational sports, but we can do the research. I did a schematic design for an exhibit on the Fugo balloons, the first intercontinental ballistic missile, a fascinating topic. Just Google that. There's a lot of information out there. But, the older I get and the more involved I am in books or exhibits, I realize that I love learning. And each book or each shipwreck process, discovery, each exhibit, I'm learning. And then if I can share that learning through what I do, I get great pleasure out of that. And I try to get my kids interested in that as well. And, they're not always in that mode, but I didn't want to learn about history when I was their age. But I have to say my most exciting Mother's Day gift this year, a couple days ago, was my daughter saying, I just finished reading Fatal Crossing. And so, we had a nice discussion about that. And she had some interesting insight there. She said, Mom, I know you want to find it. I know you're still looking. I know you want to write the Discovery edition. She said, but I don't think you have to. You have all the answers. You just don't know exactly where it happened. And I thought, that was my approach when I decided to write the book, and how wise that a 16-year-old saw that. And I still want to find it, but
of course.
But yeah,
but
we'll
it is
see.
really, what is it? A debris field on the bottom, but you've already found it in a real historical sense.
Exactly. So, and what was really important about that book and writing that book was, after finding 52 of the 58 victims' family members and talking to them and having, very cathartic conversations with so many of them, this was a book that was for them. In 1950, they were never really given the information. And so many of them said this was more than they were ever told. And so, I always said, if only the families read it, I would be happy. And I'm happy that other people have read it too. So.
Well, what a great story, Valerie. So one of the things that I know you and I had a shared experience with recently was we delved into the reality TV world together.
We sure did. Yeah.
Edition Unknown. And we did an episode with Josh Gates. And then more recently, you have done another episode with those guys about Flight 2501. Why don't you tell us?
Yeah, that was kind of crazy. It was also kind of crazy that I got a call from the producers now a couple of years ago, talking about the Griffin, because I really hadn't done a lot of research about the Griffin. I listened with fascination to the lectures you've done, Brendan, about the Griffin. And of course, I had read Chris Cole's book about Chris and Joan Forsberg's book about the Griffin. And so I knew enough to be dangerous. And I talked with producers, and I encouraged them to talk to other people. And I know they were talking to you already, and Chris. And as it turned out, they put an episode together where Joan and Chris and you and I all sort of played a role in this. And well, wouldn't you know, we didn't find the Griffin.
Gosh, really?
We didn't find the Griffin, but I've had a lot of experience, I guess you would say, with some reality television shows. Many of them have wanted me to talk about the mysterious Michigan Triangle.
Oh, God.
And we know there is no such thing. And so I did my best to try to convince these shows there was no such thing. But I have to hand it to Expedition Unknown presenting the facts. And so when I was up in Canada with Chris and Jack was up there with me, I thought twice about it, but I handed Josh a copy of my book, and I said, "Yeah, you might want to consider this for an episode." And after I handed to him, I thought, "Oh no, what have I done?" And as it turned out, he did call a couple months later, and we brainstormed an episode, and it filmed last August, and it played in February. And kudos to Josh Gates and the team at the Discovery Channel, the producers, the writers. They used my book as the Bible for this, and they really got the facts straight. There was a little fun. There was a little, we reenacted some discoveries, but for the most part, it's just right on. They're a great team to work with, and real happy with the outcome. It ended up being a 2-hour special of all things.
Oh,
So
wow. Very cool.
Kind of fun. Yeah.
What a neat opportunity to tell that story of those family members, who never kind of had that closure, and now they've got this program about it. So very cool.
Yes, and it was neat too. There's one family descended from Ken Skog, one of the victims. Ken Skog's son, Ken Skog, his grandson, and his great grandson, all named Ken Skog, are still alive, looking for answers, and they appeared in this episode as well. So it was it was a good experience for them and for all the families that watched this.
Yeah, I'll bet it. Really, actually, I got to watch it. And I really enjoyed it, and I'm not much for that kind of reality TV.
No, yeah.
So, there's what's in the future, Valerie? Do you have any projects going on? Any particular? You don't have to get into great detail, but searches or next couple of years here.
Well, we are. We've loved working with Dave Trotter over the years, but I know Dave's got a few more shipwrecks in Lake Huron that he would like to find. And so we have, thanks to the generosity of our membership and donors, we have been able to acquire our own side scan now. And kudos to Jim Kennard for getting that lined up. He helped us choose a unit. And so now we have our own side scan. Jack has built a winch. Jack is our chief boat captain, my husband Jack, and operates the side scan. And Craig Rich is heavily involved in this. So the three of us are going to be out there. For right now, I guess it can only be Jack and I until we can not socially distance. Our boat is not big enough, to bring other people on board, but we will be out there as soon as the weather cooperates, and we'll continue the search for Flight 2501. We've got that, fairly narrowed down, and not too much left. Between searching with Dave and searching with Clive and Ralph, we've covered somewhere between 900 and 1,000 square miles. So, there's a few pockets here and there that we haven't covered. There's a couple more wrecks, but the ones that disappeared, all hands, no witness accounts, those are the toughest ones. And that's what we're left with now. So those we recognize are going to take, possibly years and years. So we just have to kind of have the attitude that every square mile is 1 square mile closer to a discovery. And we couldn't have our annual, would have been our 22nd annual film festival this year in Holland. We had to cancel about a week before the event, but fortunately we had enough residual funds in the bank to cover our searching. So fingers crossed.
Very cool, Valerie. Well, I wish you guys the best of luck. I hope that you're able to put to rest some of those mysteries that are still waiting out there. And you guys do such a great job of telling those stories. That's really a strength. And I think, the amount of work you put into it, into not just telling the stories through your talks, but also through books and now through museum exhibits.
Yeah, museum and our website, MichiganShipwrecks.org. Craig Rich has been running that website now for over 20 years, and he does a great job, maintaining it and putting new stories up. And gosh, just a couple weeks ago, we identified, a bone pile on the Garden Peninsula, and that made some Facebook media, attention. It was a wreck that you had done a lot of research on, Brendan, our canters. And so we did our remote COVID survey with the help of a homeowner up there, and never done that before. So we're still at play despite our crazy new world.
That's an interesting little wreck. I thought she was out on the reefs. I had done quite a bit of research on that little ship, and I was going to go up there and look for it.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to learn that it was on shore under the beach, and that's really useful.
On shore, very.
That you were able to identify that and share that information, because you know what? I don't have to go scanning for it now.
Right. And interestingly, it was all because of the dead wood, very interesting triangular shaped piece, and the size of the dead wood and the position of the wreckage just totally matched the Arcantus. And what was so fascinating is that was a Holland-owned ship. So here we are in Holland, Michigan, surveying remotely a ship 350 miles away, and it's from our town. So
and named after one of your mayors, right?
Named after our former mayor. Yeah. So Craig put together a lot of research on that.
I thought that was pretty cool, Valerie. Well, we're running out of time. We're running kind of right up on the at the end here. So I've got a couple of housekeeping things, but Valerie, thank you so much for a wonderful show and being our guest. I really enjoyed revisiting all this stuff and kind of walking through the many contributions that you've made over the years to the maritime history and particularly the Great Lakes Shipwreck community. So it's a real privilege.
Thank you, and thanks for your collaboration over the years. You've helped us greatly on a number of projects.
It's a lot of fun. I like working with you guys. So a couple of things. Just want to remind everybody, again, if you tuned in late, next week, we have the Wisconsin State underwater archaeologist, Tamara Thompson, is going to be on the show. You probably saw her if you watched our Shipwreck Festival. She did an excellent presentation, and I'm going to interview Tammy, and we're going to get to know her a little bit better. And then, of course, the week after that, I've got one of the most legendary wreck hunters on the Great Lakes, David Trotter, is going to be with us. And so I'm really excited to have Dave on the show. I have known him for many years, and it'll be fun to catch up with him. I haven't talked to Dave other than a couple of phone calls for many years now. So looking forward to that. So everybody, I just want to give everybody a heads up. I'm going to try this chat room thing, and we're going to see how it goes. So give us a couple of minutes to shut down the dog and pony show here and to launch the room. And then those of you who want to come on and talk about whatever, I think we're going to be talking about some of our initiatives we got going on here. I know Tom Hadfield's been working to set up an online data, a Google Earth database of all of the space wrecks that we've been finding. So that's been a great initiative that he's really been moving forward. So kudos to Tom for his work on that. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the show. And thank you so much, Valerie, for being on. Good night, everybody.